So, all kidding aside, speaking of healthcare,
Yes.
I don't know what it is going to take to get people that are obsessed with Andrew Yang to get that he's not good. And he's not good. Now, there's a bigger conversation that I think we need to have, and I think Matt pointed this out to me off mic, that, you know, this idea of $1 amount a month is extremely appealing to people, and we're going to need to have a conversation about that that's more in depth. And I think I've been very clear that I don't have a strong feeling about it either way. I'm pretty agnostic about it, but it needs to be part of a much broader set of packages, because even just on a practical level, and this is one area that I'm going to keep repeating, we don't have time to go over all of them. No one, because I know you guys, some of his people always freak out, always have big meltdowns anytime he's criticized. And I get the graphs, and I get you're mean, and I get all of that. What are you going to do on a regulatory level? And of course, we're not even talking about dealing with the housing crisis as like an actual policy issue. There is nothing as this stands that does not mean that this $1,000 a month is not sucked up by a landlord, particularly in New York or San Francisco or in other areas where, frankly, this $1,000 will go a lot less far. So I'm interested in the nuances of this conversation, but I also think it's interesting that, you know, recently he sort of said he kind of was resonating with Joe Biden. To be fair, it's because he said Joe Biden, you know, sought him out to speak to him. And now here he is. And by the way, and through the whole line, he's had nothing to say about foreign policy really, except for an extremely reactionary stance on Israel, which I think is worth noting. But I do just want to look at this. This is amazing.
That also just is the best meme.
I think this is the best meme of the 2020 cycle, actually. This is Yang 2020 as the Joker going down the steps, and then behind him is the landlord raising your rent by $1,000. I mean, yeah. But here is Andrew Yang being clear that he does not support, in fact, Medicare for all. Let's just play this and then do your thing.
You're right about everything you've said about this. I mean, this is mind-boggling.
Mind-boggling.
Medicare for all, page 8 of Senator Bernie Sanders' bill eliminates private insurers. Does that mean that you do not support the Bernie Sanders Medicaid for all bill?
I support the spirit of what Bernie is trying to accomplish.
Pause it. I have to say, this is literally the same thing he used when he opposed the minimum wage, which he also opposes. He doesn't oppose the minimum wage. He opposes a minimum wage increase. That's the same language he used in the interview. I support the spirit of it more.
Of what Bernie is trying to accomplish. I do think that outlawing private insurance in a very short period of time is a bit too disruptive, and I would not do it.
I thought he supped at the cult of disruption.
Disruption, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Disruptive to who?
Yeah, exactly.
The insurance companies.
What is this supposed to be, this 1,000? I don't even understand.
It's a bribe. It's an anti-class antagonism bribe.
Right. It's weird.
Or
it's the advance effort. It's like the first effort, basically, to write off the massive part of the population, okay, and set up very much a truly two-tiered social order, where everyone else lives on sort of handouts from the government, okay, and the other people do productive, meaningful activities.
Exactly. Well, yeah. Well, also the people who are doing productive, meaningful activities are still the people who are getting the $1,000. They're the workers. And, you know, we were talking earlier about the global wealth report that came out from Credit Suisse. And think about this. In the United States, 71% of the rise in wealth came from financial assets. And what are financial assets?
Yeah.
But a claim on the productive labor of the American worker. So when you're seeing this massive disparity that's going on in this country, it's about stolen value from the working class that's going to the top portion of our society. And what $1,000 a month does is it, you know, protects people from the worst aspects of this exploitation while maintaining the entire system of exploitation that's allowed for one of the greatest transfers of wealth in human history to the top 1%. That's what the Yang bucks are really about. And that's why libertarians and right-wingers and people in Silicon Valley like this idea of UBI.
And also, I would just say too, I mean, it's also, I actually think part of the reason it does resonate with a certain set of people is because of a profound sense of exhaustion and a complete lack of historical understanding, which would speak to Professor Kaye and a sense that no change is actually possible. And what is very interesting in his message is that he fuses. I mean, look, I think some of the, I'll say I like the spirit of humanity first. I like the spirit of talking about compassion and public good. But the primary messages rest on a radical simplification of automation, which, by the way, I'm not denying that it isn't a factor and it isn't doing something. I'm saying that it is a radical simplification that he's talking about in a teleological sense, that it's an inevitability that will happen, that A, he's exaggerating the extent of it, and B, or maybe misreading it, and B, there's ways of stopping it. Tomorrow, if 30 million people are going to lose their jobs because of automation, we start regulating against automation, right? Like, that's the actual proper policy answer that even Tucker Carlson would give you, for God's sake. And that's another major danger of the Yang thing. And then he's combining that with a real message that no big problems can be solved. This happens when you talk about a wealth tax, when you talk about healthcare, when you talk about minimum wage, when you talk about when people say, well, you're quite focused on tech. What about the tech monopolies? Well, it can't really happen. So what then is the answer if there's an absolute certainty and religious faith in technological progress? There's a complete rejection of actual struggle in politics. Well, we can throw you some trinkets. And again, I'm not dismissing the fact for a vast majority of my life, $1,000 would have been a huge difference. Now, again, if it actually stayed in my pocket, which I don't, I'm sorry, especially now that he doesn't support Medicare for all, I don't see how the hell it's going to stay in your pocket. But the bottom line is that it is a fusion of religious faith in progress in technological progress as inevitable, a failure and exhaustion of actual politics, and then a retreating to trinkets instead of struggle. And the bottom line is that if you want to counteract these trends and live a meaningful life and have some prosperity, you have to be thinking about single payer, you got to be thinking about labor unions, you have to be thinking about actual power.
Yeah,
not
and some real redistribution of national income and wealth, period. And my question here is, where is it? Is he got like what is his following in the polls?
No, some of them are up to 7 or 8%.
He's above, I think nationally he's above Kamala now. He's like at 5%.
Now that's on the flip side. I would say good for him because Kamala
She's a better candidate. Yeah.
Because at very least Yang will actually be talking about things like joblessness and lack of purpose and so on. I mean, kudos to him relative to, a Klobuchar frankly, he should be pulling ahead of Buttigieg, frankly. I mean, look, I compared to a lot of, or certainly Biden, for God's sake. So I actually understand that on some level. He's at least putting material needs in the conversation, but his analysis and his prescription are utterly disastrous. Ben Burgess always uses the examples of the grain subsidies in the dying days of Rome for some of the serfs. Of this sort of like to cool the temperature. He knows this better than me, but basically they're an equivalent of a UBI. And it should come as a surprise to no one that the prime people talking about UBI, are not labor union leaders. They're Silicon Valley people.
Yeah. I've been getting a lot of calls from newspapers.
Yeah.
And PolitiFact. Is UBI what Thomas Paine had in mind when he talked about in agrarian justice? And I said,
didn't he have like the actuarial tables and stuff in the back of one of his books or something like that? Am I remembering that?
That I'm not sure of, but I can tell you this. What Thomas Paine proposed was essentially Social Security for the elderly, and for young people, a stake in life, a start in life. He's not talking about annual payments. Number one. Number two, he was never talking about an annual basic income kind of thing. He was talking about giving young people, boys and girls, men and women, a sum of money to get them going in life in the midst of a world in which there was no public assistance, okay? And moreover, the idea was that you were going to tax the landed rich to make this happen.
Yep.
And by the way, there are those who would say that when he talked about this in the pamphlet, it was actually a threat to tell the landed rich, if you don't do this, we're coming for you. Okay.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, how does Yang pay for all of this? A VAT tax, which is the most regressive tax known to humanity. And he always goes, No, we'll do it through a tax on luxury goods. Which, let's just use a little bit of logic. Number one, if all of the major reforms that we need, like a wealth tax or breaking up Silicon Valley monopolies, are basically politically impossible, why would those same rich people allow for a VAT that doesn't favor them? So that's number one. And then number two, how do you define? Here is one, I will be a fiscal scold on this. If you are literally talking about a VAT tax on the purchase of private jets and, Japanese whiskey, that VAT will not cover a basic income. It won't. So in order to cover it, and he does himself, he talks about Amazon transactions, you have to get into the basic bare bones of what most people spend their money on, which is why the VAT from Kenya to the UK is the most hated tax on the planet, because it is a add-on to the basic necessities of life. It's such a disaster. It really blows my fucking mind that people are talking about this like this.
I mean, I believe in small d democracy.
Right.
But I also have to tell you, the sooner they clear out Yang, Klobuchar, all of this crew, and we get down to some serious conversation between Bernie and Warren, the happier I am going to be. Okay?
Agree.
Then we can start seriously talking about how we're going to address the gross inequalities of power and wealth. We're going to start talking about how we're going to secure working people's rights. How we're going to, right now, the talk of UBI and even to look at Jake Tapper up there on the screen, for example, talking to Bernie about this stuff, it's just outrageous. I mean, how can somebody possibly making that kind of money challenged? It is disgusting. It is immoral.
Yep.
Yeah, I think Yang is less objectionable than Tulsi is, but I would also say that both of them should feel ashamed that voters spent any time learning who they were and not more about Bernie Sanders. In this
Precisely,
field.
and you should feel ashamed if you're still, look, the prime of my critique is Warren. This election matters. I'm not playing around. That triggers some people. Whatever, it matters, and I'm drawing that distinction. But if you are still dicking around with Yang and Tulsi and you identify as a progressive, if your 1% fuck around vote undermines a Bernie Sanders presidency, I'm all about forgiveness, transformation, rehabilitation, everything. You should at least feel a stinging sense of embarrassment for the rest of your life. But we're going to work to make sure that your stupid vote for those candidates does not impinge on the election, because we're going to elect Bernie Sanders. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.